God, she stinks. I can't wait for her to leave so I can air out the room. The smell of old age is killing me. I heard my daughter-in-law, Melanie, whisper. I was standing just behind the half-open door to the living room, a shadow in my own home. My breath was a soft, quiet thing, practiced in the art of taking up as little space as possible. In my hands, I held a porcelain teacup, the one with the tiny blue forget-me-nots painted around the rim. It was filled with hot chamomile tea, the steam rising in a fragrant column, warming the skin of my knuckles. This was my ritual, my small, nightly offering of peace to them, to my son Greg and his wife. A quiet gesture that said, "Asterisk, I am here, but I will not be a burden. Asterisk." The runner in the hallway was soft, worn down by years of footsteps muffling my approach. The only light came from the living room, a warm, golden rectangle spilling into the dark, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Inside that light, they existed in their world. I heard the low murmur of the television, the rustle of a magazine page turning. It was a picture of domestic tranquility, a scene I had observed from the edges for the last 2 years since my husband David passed. And then I heard her voice, Melanie's. It wasn't loud. It was worse. It was a conspiratorial whisper, a secret shared in the false safety of their sanctum. A sound meant only for my son. When she's gone, I can finally air out this room. The smell of old age is killing me. The words didn't crash over me like a wave. They slid into me like a shard of ice, piercing something deep and vital. My breath caught in my throat. A tiny, sharp thing. But my hand, the one holding the cup, remained perfectly still. The porcelain did not tremble. The tea did not slosh. It was a strange, disconnected calm, as if I were watching this happen to another woman, a character in a sad film. A woman who had just been reduced from a person to an odor, a contamination. I waited for Greg's reply, for the defense that a son should offer his mother, a sharp word, a gentle rebuke, anything. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, and then it was broken. Not by words, but by a sound far more damning. A sigh. A long, weary exhalation from my son. It wasn't a sigh of disagreement. It was a sigh of resignation, of tired agreement. It was the sound of a man too weak to stand up for his own mother against the quiet tyranny of his wife. That sigh was the second blow, the one that shattered the last of my illusions. It confirmed the truth. I was utterly, completely alone here. I did not move forward. I did not retreat in haste. I simply took one deliberate, silent step backward, melting back into the shadows from which I had come. The soft carpet swallowed the sound of my retreat. I was already becoming a ghost in their house. I turned and walked back to my room, my movements measured and unnaturally steady. My heart wasn't pounding. It was beating with a slow, heavy, funereal rhythm. I closed my door, and the click of the latch was not a sound of privacy, but of separation, a final, quiet punctuation mark at the end of a long, painful sentence. I placed the teacup on the cherry-wood dresser, next to the silver-framed photograph of David. The tea, intended as an offering of comfort to them, now sat in my room, a bitter, useless relic. David smiled out from the frame, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He had hands that built things a bookshelf for our first apartment, a cradle for Greg, a life for us. He would have seen the rot in the foundations of this family long ago. He would never have let me become a guest in my own life. My eyes swept across the room. My room. For how long had I been telling myself that? It was their house. I was just a tenant, living in a space that was once Greg's childhood bedroom, now repurposed into a museum of my slowly shrinking existence. There were my books, stacked neatly on the shelves David had built, their spines a colorful tapestry of history and poetry, worlds I could escape into. There was the hand-knitted wool shawl draped over the armchair, the one I'd pull around my shoulders when the evenings grew cold. There were the stacks of letters from my sister, tied with a faded silk ribbon, a physical record of a life lived, of connections that mattered. These things, which had once been the fabric of my comfort, now seemed like clutter, evidence of a life that was leaving a scent. The Times smell of old age *. I finally understood. It wasn't the scent of the lavender sachets I kept in my drawers, or the faint, clean smell of my almond soap. It wasn't a physical smell at all. It was the smell of my presence, the smell of my memories, the smell of my mortality, a quiet, constant reminder in their pristine, forward-looking home that life ends, that bodies fail, that youth is fleeting. I was a living, breathing Times memento mori *, and my very essence was polluting their carefully curated air. I sat on the edge of my bed, the mattress sighing softly under my weight. I felt the familiar dip, the place I had slept in every night for 2 years, trying to be invisible, to be silent, to be clean. And for what? To be wished away so a window could be opened. There was no explosion of anger, no flood of self-pitying tears. What bloomed in the frozen landscape of my heart was something else entirely. Clarity. It was a cold, pure, and absolute clarity. You cannot reason with people who do not see you as a person. You cannot fight for a place in a home where your existence is considered an inconvenience to be aired out. The only thing you can do is leave, not in defeat, but in dignity. The battle wasn't to stay. The battle was to build something new. My gaze fell upon my phone, resting on the nightstand. My fingers, which had trembled with age just this morning while trying to button my cardigan, now moved with the precision of a surgeon. I picked it up. The screen lit up, illuminating my face in its cool, blue light. I didn't open my contacts to call my sister and cry. I didn't open a messaging app to confront my son with his betrayal. I opened the web browser. My thumbs, steady and sure, tapped out the words into the search bar, each letter a tiny hammer blow, forging a new future. Retirement homes. With an ocean view, the search results populated the screen, a list of names and addresses, each a potential door out of this life. But my fingers didn't need to scroll. They moved with an old, sad muscle memory, clicking on a bookmark I had saved months ago, tucked away in a folder, simply labeled contingencies. It was a thought I'd had on a particularly lonely afternoon, a fleeting moment of foresight that I had dismissed as morbid. Asterisk, just in case. Asterisk, I had told myself. Asterisk, it's good to be prepared. Asterisk, I never imagined the case would be this. The website for Seaview Meadows Senior Living loaded. The images were bright, professional, and sterile. Silver-haired residents laughed over a game of chess. A smiling woman tended to a perfect rose garden. A pristine, sun-drenched room with a large window looked out onto a digitally enhanced, impossibly blue ocean. It was a fantasy, a brochure's promise. But in that moment, it was more real and more attainable than the life I was living in this house. The air in their photos looked clean. It looked breathable. I didn't linger on the pictures of smiling strangers. I was a builder, not a dreamer. I navigated to the floor plans and availability tab. My eyes scanned the lists, the numbers, the square footage. My mind which had felt so foggy with unspoken grief for 2 years, was now a sharp, efficient instrument. I was no longer Nora, the grieving widow, the quiet mother-in-law. I was Nora, the project manager of my own salvation. There it was. Asterisk, Suite 3B, oceanfront balcony. Available immediately. Asterisk. The words seemed to pulse on the screen. Asterisk. Immediately. Asterisk. It was a sign, a command. My hand moved from the laptop to the phone. The muffled sound of the television from the living room seeped under my door, a laugh track from some sitcom, a hollow, canned sound that underscored the profound lack of joy in this house. They were in there, comfortable in their ignorance, breathing their clean air, while I was in here, dismantling the life I had tried to build alongside them. Their obliviousness was not an insult. It was a tool. It was the cover of darkness I needed to execute my plan. I pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. I held my breath, my back straight, my posture as formal as if I were in a boardroom. Seaview Meadows. This is Miss Davis speaking. How may I help you? The voice was exactly as I needed it to be. Calm, professional, warm but not pitying. It was the sound of competence. It was the sound of respect. It was the first ray of light. Good evening, I began, and my own voice surprised me with its steadiness. It was a stranger's voice, devoid of the tremor of hurt that was vibrating deep inside my bones. My name is Nora Vance. I was looking at your website, and I'm calling to inquire about Suite 3B. Of course, Mrs. Vance, she said, the sound of keyboard clicks accompanying her words. Yes, the oceanfront balcony suite. It just became available this morning. It's a lovely space. I'd like to take it, I said. No hesitation. No questions about amenities or meal plans. Those were details. Details could be managed later. The foundation had to be laid now. There was a brief pause on the other end. Wonderful. We typically schedule a tour and a consultation first. That won't be necessary, I stated, my tone polite, but firm. I'm prepared to pay the deposit and the first month's rent immediately via a bank transfer. I would like to move in tomorrow morning. Another pause, this one filled with what I sensed was a mixture of surprise and professional assessment. Miss Davis was likely trying to gauge if I was of sound mind, if this was a rash decision. I understand this is moving very quickly, Mrs. Vance, she said carefully. May I ask, are you in a safe and comfortable situation at the moment? The question was so full of genuine, unexpected concern that it almost broke through my armor. It was the first time in 2 years anyone had asked about my well-being, but I couldn't afford to crack. Not yet. I am perfectly safe, I replied, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. My situation has simply changed, and I am a woman who believes in decisive action. You'll find all my paperwork is in order. My late husband and I were always thorough planners. That seemed to satisfy her. Very well, Mrs. Vance. I admire a woman of conviction. I'll email you the necessary forms and payment information right now. If you can have them completed and the transfer made tonight, I will have Suite 3B ready for your arrival at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you, Miss Davis, I said. You've been very helpful. It's my pleasure. We look forward to welcoming you to Seaview Meadows, Nora. She used my first name. It was a small thing, but it landed with the force of a revelation. To her, I was not a smell or a problem. I was Nora. After I hung up, I sat in the silence, the hum of the laptop my only companion. The email arrived a minute later with a cheerful ping. The bureaucratic war had begun, and I had just won the first, most important battle. Then I began to pack. I didn't pull out boxes. I didn't start emptying drawers. I slid the old, worn leather suitcase from under my bed. It was David's, the one he took on business trips, its corners scuffed from 100 airports and train stations. The smell of him, faint traces of cedar and old paper still clung to the lining. I was not moving my life. I was evacuating my identity. And an identity, I decided, did not require much luggage. First, the photos. I took the silver frame from the dresser. I slid out the picture of David and put it in the suitcase, wrapping it in a soft cashmere scarf. I opened the shoebox on the top shelf of my closet and sifted through the loose snapshots. Me and David on our wedding day, young and impossibly hopeful. Greg, as a little boy, grinning with a missing front tooth, his arms wrapped around my neck. My parents, standing proudly in front of their first house. I chose only 5 pictures, 5 anchors to my past. The rest I left. They belong to the history of this house now, not to the future of the woman leaving it. Next, the books. I couldn't take my library, the shelves of friends who had kept me company in the silent hours. I chose only 2. A worn, leather-bound volume of Mary Oliver's poetry, its pages soft as cloth, its margins filled with my faint pencil annotations, and a thick history of the age of exploration, a reminder that new worlds could always be discovered, even at 76. Then, the small, lacquered jewelry box David had brought me from Japan. It didn't hold much of monetary value. My wedding band, which I never took off. His signet ring, which I now wore on a chain around my neck. A pair of pearl earrings he'd given me for our 30th anniversary. It wasn't the jewelry I was packing. It was the love they represented. I packed 3 changes of clothes, my best wool coat, the lavender sachets, and my almond soap. I was taking my scent with me. When I was done, the single suitcase stood by the door, a silent, solitary soldier ready for deployment. The room looked almost untouched. The bed was made. The furniture was in its place. The shelves were still full. To a casual observer, nothing had changed. But I knew that the soul of the room was now locked inside that leather case. All that was left was a shell, a space waiting to be aired out. I completed the forms online, made the transfer, and sent a confirmation email to Miss Davis. It was done, all of it, conducted in the quiet hum of my laptop, under the cover of a sitcom laugh track. My entire life had been upended and rerouted in under 2 hours. I felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but beneath it, a current of something I hadn't felt in years. Power. The feeling of the captain's wheel, solid and real, back in my own hands. I was no longer drifting. I was navigating, and my course was set for the ocean. With the digital paperwork filed and the suitcase standing sentinel by the door, a strange calm settled over me. The storm inside had passed, leaving behind the quiet, eerie stillness of a world irrevocably altered. All that remained was to live out the final few hours in this house, a place that was now just a stage for the last act of a play I was desperate to finish. I had to navigate the twilight period between decision and departure, moving through their world like a visiting diplomat from a country they didn't know existed, the sovereign state of my own future. I woke the next morning before the sun, my body still adhering to the old rhythms even as my soul was preparing for a new one. The house was quiet, steeped in the deep, slumbering silence of early morning. For a moment, habit nearly pulled me into my old routine. tiptoe to the kitchen, put the coffee on so the aroma would gently wake them, check the forecast to see if Greg needed his heavier coat. But I stopped myself, my hand on the doorknob. That Nora, the silent, accommodating caretaker, had packed her bags last night. The woman standing here now owed them nothing, not even coffee. Instead, I sat in the armchair in my room and watched the sky outside my window slowly bleed from inky violet to a soft, pearly gray. I didn't turn on a light. I simply watched the world awaken, feeling like a passenger on a train, observing a familiar landscape for the last time before it disappears around a bend. The first test came around 7:30, a light tap on my door, followed by Greg's voice, muffled and laced with sleep. "Mom, is the coffee on?" For 2 years, that question had been my morning alarm. For 2 years, my answer had been to open the door with a smile and say, "Of course, dear. Be ready in 5 minutes." Today, I remained seated. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, a small, deliberate act of defiance. "Mom," he called again, a note of confusion in his voice. "No, Greg," I answered, my voice clear and calm, carrying through the wood of the door. "It's not." I heard a pause, then the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall. I imagined his perplexed expression, the minor disruption to his seamless morning routine. It was a tiny tear in the fabric of their expectations, the first thread I had refused to weave, and it felt like a small, private victory. I emerged from my room an hour later, showered and dressed in the clothes I planned to leave in. The suitcase was now tucked discreetly back under the bed, out of sight. I was a spy in the final hours of her mission. In the kitchen, Melanie was standing at the counter, frowning at the silent coffee machine as if it had personally betrayed her. She was already dressed for work in a severe, minimalist gray dress that made her look like a chic architect of sterile spaces. She glanced up as I entered, her annoyance barely concealed. "Good morning, Nora," she said, her voice tight. "The coffee maker seems to be broken." "Perhaps," I said evenly, moving past her to the refrigerator. I took out the carton of milk, poured a small amount into a glass, and drank it standing by the counter. I didn't offer to look at the machine. I didn't suggest the French press in the back of the pantry. I simply drank my milk. Her eyes narrowed slightly. My passivity, my refusal to engage and solve her morning problem, was a foreign language to her. I had always been the fixer of small domestic crises, the smoother of ruffled feathers. This new, neutral Nora was an anomaly she couldn't categorize. Greg entered, looking rumpled and vaguely unsettled. "Mel, I'm running late. Can you just grab a coffee on your way?" He glanced at me, a question in his eyes which I refused to answer. He was a grown man. He could solve the mystery of the coffee machine himself. I finished my milk, rinsed my glass, and placed it in the dishwasher. "I'm going for a walk," I announced to the room in general. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't say when I'd be back. I was making a statement of autonomy, and it felt as liberating as shouting from a mountaintop. I walked for over an hour, leaving my phone in my room. I walked through the manicured suburban streets, past identical houses with perfect lawns, and felt a profound sense of detachment. This was their world, a world of surfaces and appearances, of unspoken resentments and weaponized sighs. It was never truly mine. My path led me to a small park with a duck pond, and I sat on a bench, feeling the cool morning air on my face. The air here felt different. It was just air. It didn't carry the weight of expectation or the scent of being unwanted. When I returned, the house was empty. A note on the counter from Greg read, *, "Went to work. See you tonight. Love you. *. The words felt hollow, a perfunctory scrawl from a son who had sighed away his loyalty the night before. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. At 9:45, a taxi I had called from the park's payphone pulled up to the curb. I walked calmly to my room, pulled the suitcase from under the bed, and walked out the front door, closing it softly behind me. I didn't look back. The final confrontation, the one I had been steeling myself for, happened over the phone during my last supper in that house. A silent meal of toast and tea I had taken in my room the night before my departure was scheduled in my mind. In reality, the final meal was that glass of milk. This scene is a memory, a reliving of the final test. I had been sitting at the dining table, pushing a piece of baked chicken around my plate. The silence was thick with unspoken things. Melanie, I knew, hated silence. She needed to fill it, to manage it, to direct it. "Nora," she began, her tone overly bright, the kind she used when assigning a task she was framing as a delightful joint activity. "I'm planning to tackle the curtains in the guest room tomorrow. They're dreadfully dusty. I'll need you to help me get them down and washed. We can make a day of it." The guest room. She had stopped calling it your room months ago. It was a subtle, cruel erasure. The old Nora would have agreed instantly. She would have felt a small, pathetic flicker of gratitude for being included, for being given a purpose, for being times needed, asterisk. She would have said, "Of course, dear. What time should we start?" But the old Nora was gone. I took a slow, deliberate bite of chicken. I chewed it thoroughly. I swallowed. I took a small sip of water. I placed my fork and knife neatly together on my plate. Only then did I lift my eyes to meet hers. "I'm afraid I'll be busy tomorrow," I said. My voice was not cold. It was not angry. It was simply a statement of fact, as neutral as saying, "The sky is blue." Melanie's smile faltered. It was a small, almost imperceptible twitch, but I saw it. She was a machine that had just received an input it could not compute. Busy? Busy with what? The question was sharp, an accusation. My time, in her mind, was her resource to allocate. "With my own affairs," I replied, and offered no more. The silence that followed was different. It was not the comfortable silence of a family at rest. It was the tense, humming silence of a power cord that had just been severed. I could feel Greg shifting uncomfortably beside me. I didn't look at him. His discomfort was his own to manage. He had made his choice with his sigh. "Well," Melanie said, her voice brittle, "that's rather unhelpful. I was counting on you." The words were meant to be a guilt-laced dart, but they couldn't pierce my new armor. Guilt requires an emotional attachment, a hook to latch onto. I had methodically removed all the hooks. Her needs were no longer my responsibility. Her disappointment was no longer my burden. I picked up my napkin and gently dabbed the corners of my mouth. "This was a lovely dinner, Melanie. Thank you." I stood up, took my plate, and carried it to the kitchen. It was nearly empty, my final meal, my last supper in the house of my son. As I rinsed the plate and placed it in the dishwasher, I felt the final, gossamer thread of obligation snap. Each no I had uttered to their expectations that day was a resounding yes to my own freedom. I didn't say goodnight. I simply walked back to my room and closed the door, leaving them alone in the ringing silence, staring at my empty chair, finally beginning to sense that a border had been drawn, and they were, for the first time, on the other side of it. That evening, after the tense and strangely silent dinner, I laid out the clothes I would wear for my departure. A simple pair of gray trousers, a soft cashmere sweater, and my most comfortable walking shoes. It was the uniform of a traveler, practical and unassuming. I went to bed early but did not sleep. Instead, I lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me. The groan of the pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of a passing train sounds that had woven themselves into the fabric of my life for the past 2 years. They were no longer the sounds of home, but the fading echoes of a place I had already left behind. The taxi was scheduled for 5 a.m. Long before it arrived, I was awake and ready. I did not need an alarm clock. A deep, internal urgency had taken its place. In the pre-dawn stillness, I made my bed one last time, pulling the quilt up tight, smoothing out every wrinkle until the surface was as calm and undisturbed as a frozen lake. It was an act of closure, a final, respectful gesture to the space that had sheltered me, however imperfectly. I took a small, crisp sheet of notepaper from the desk drawer and my favorite fountain pen. The pen, a gift from David, felt weighty and significant in my hand. I thought for a moment about what to write. I could have filled pages with accusations, with the pain and humiliation I felt. I could have detailed every slight, every moment of casual cruelty, every sigh of weary tolerance. I could have written a testament to my own invisible suffering. But a builder does not waste materials on a condemned structure. My declaration of independence would not be a long and winding indictment. It would be a mirror, small, simple, and brutally clear, reflecting their own words back at them. I wrote just 2 words. Asterisk, air it out. Asterisk. I folded the note once and placed it squarely in the center of the pillow, a stark white rectangle against the pale blue cotton. It looked less like a message and more like a verdict. My suitcase was waiting. I lifted it, the weight of my entire condensed life surprisingly manageable in one hand. I opened my door, listening for any sound from their bedroom down the hall. Nothing. They were asleep, lost in dreams where their world was still intact, their mother still a fixture in the room down the hall, their air still pure. I walked down the hallway, each step a deliberate move away from the past. I didn't let my hand trail along the wall. I didn't pause to look at the family photos hanging there. Greg's graduation, his wedding, the forced smiles of Christmases past. They were artifacts from another woman's life. At the front door, I stopped. I slid the chain, the metallic click unnaturally loud in the silence. I turned the deadbolt. The lock, which had been meant to keep the outside world out, was now letting me go. I slipped my house key off my keychain and left it on the small entryway table. A final, silent act of severance. I stepped outside into the cool, damp air of the morning. A sliver of moon hung in the inky sky. The taxi was there, waiting at the curb, its headlights cutting 2 cones of yellow into the darkness. The driver, a kind-faced man with tired eyes, got out and took my suitcase without a word, placing it gently in the trunk. I got into the back seat. The vinyl was cool against my skin. As he pulled away from the curb, I kept my eyes fixed forward. I did not turn my head for one last look at the house, at the window of the room that was no longer mine. To look back would be to give it power, to acknowledge a loss, but I hadn't lost anything. I had reclaimed myself. I was looking ahead, towards the faint, promising glow of dawn on the horizon, towards the smell of the sea. The scene shifts. It is now 9 a.m. The sun is streaming through the windows of the house, illuminating the dust motes Greg and Melanie had failed to see. Melanie stands at the bottom of the stairs, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. She is holding a large, empty laundry basket. Today is the day of the great purge. The day she reclaims the guest room and finally airs out the clinging, oppressive scent of the past. I'm going to get started on those curtains, she calls out to Greg, who's in the kitchen, fumbling with the now functional coffee machine. I swear, I can smell that musty old person smell from here. Greg grunts a non-committal reply, his mind on a looming deadline at work. He is vaguely aware that his mother had been busy yesterday, but the full implication of her quiet detachment has not yet penetrated his self-absorption. Melanie climbs the stairs, her steps light and purposeful. She feels a thrill of anticipation. Soon this last bastion of Nora-ness, this cluttered, memory-filled room, will be a blank canvas. She imagines it with a sleek, modern daybed, a minimalist art print on the wall, and an expensive scented candle, perhaps something with notes of citrus and basil, the antithesis of lavender sachets and old books. She reaches the door to Nora's room. It's closed. Asterisk. Perfect. Asterisk. She thinks. Asterisk. She's probably still in bed, feeling sulky about yesterday. Asterisk. The thought pleases her. She doesn't knock. It's her house, after all. She turns the knob and pushes the door open, a bright, slightly forced smile on her face. Rise and shine, Nora! We've got work to do! The words die on her lips. The smile freezes, then melts away, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. The room is silent. It is pristine. The bed is perfectly made, the quilt pulled taut with military precision. The surfaces are clear. The armchair is empty. The books on the shelves stand in silent, orderly rows. But the room is not just neat. It is empty. There is a profound stillness, a void where a human presence should be. Nora is not in the bed. She is not in the chair. She is not there. Melanie takes a hesitant step inside, the laundry basket bumping against her leg. Nora, she calls out, her voice suddenly small in the cavernous silence. Her eyes scan the room, looking for a clue, for something out of place, and then she sees it. A single, white, folded piece of paper placed with deliberate care in the very center of the pillow. She walks towards the bed, a strange, cold feeling creeping up her spine. This is wrong. This is not how the day was supposed to go. She reaches out and picks up the note. Her fingers feel clumsy, numb. She unfolds it. She reads the 2 words. Asterisk. Air it out. Asterisk. For a long moment, she simply stands there, staring at the note. The paper trembles slightly in her hand. The words are not an explanation. They are an echo. Her own words, thrown back at her from a place of immense, unknowable silence. Her face, which had been alight with smug triumph just moments before, becomes a mask of disbelief. The triumph curdles into confusion, and then, slowly, into a dawning, sickening horror. This isn't sulking. This isn't a passive-aggressive game. This is something else, something final. Greg! Her voice is a choked whisper. Greg, get up here. Footsteps thunder up the stairs. Greg appears in the doorway, a coffee mug in his hand, an annoyed expression on his face. What is it, Mel? I'm going to be late. His eyes take in the scene. His wife standing frozen by the bed like a statue. The unnaturally tidy room. The palpable absence of his mother. What's going on? He asks, his annoyance giving way to a flicker of unease. Where's Mom? Melanie doesn't answer. She just holds out the note. He walks over, takes it from her trembling hand, and reads it. His face goes pale. The color drains from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, grayish pallor. The coffee mug slips from his suddenly nerveless fingers and crashes to the floor, shattering on the hardwood, the dark liquid spreading like a spreading stain. Oh, God, he breathes, the words barely audible. What did we do? He looks at the note, then at the empty room, then at his wife's horrified face. The words on the paper are not just his mother's, they are theirs. He remembers the conversation. He remembers his sigh, that sigh which had seemed so insignificant, so harmless, now feels like the trigger for a catastrophe. They stand there, the two of them, in the middle of the perfectly neat, soullessly empty room. Melanie's triumphant plan to air it out has come true in the most literal, horrifying way imaginable. The room is empty. The smell of old age is gone. And in its place is a terrifying, echoing void, filled with the stench of their own casual cruelty. They have finally gotten what they wanted, and they are utterly, completely terrified. The taxi ride was a journey through a series of liminal spaces. From the hushed, sleeping suburbs, we moved onto the humming arteries of the highway just as the city began to wake. The sky transformed, the deep indigo of night giving way to streaks of lavender and rose, and finally, to a brilliant, hopeful gold. I watched the world slide by outside my window, not as a passive observer, but as an explorer venturing into uncharted territory. With every mile that separated me from that house, I felt a physical weight lifting from my shoulders, a pressure easing in my chest that I hadn't even realized was there. I was no longer holding my breath. When we finally turned onto the coastal highway, I saw it, the ocean. It wasn't the impossibly blue, placid sea from the brochure's photograph. It was real. It was a vast expanse of shimmering steel gray under the morning sun, restless and alive, capped with frothing white lace. The sheer, raw immensity of it filled the window, dwarfing everything else, and I felt a sense of profound, soul-deep relief. It was a landscape that matched the scale of my own newfound freedom. Seaview Meadows was a handsome, well-maintained building of white stucco and glass, perched on a low cliff overlooking the water. It didn't look like an institution. It looked like a hotel you might choose for a peaceful, restorative vacation. As the taxi pulled into the circular driveway, I saw a woman standing at the glass entrance doors, waiting. She was tall and elegant, with her silver hair pulled back in a chic twist, wearing a crisp navy blue dress. It had to be Miss Davis. She opened my door before the driver could, her smile warm but professional. "Nora Vance? I'm Eleanor Davis. Welcome to Seaview Meadows." Her handshake was firm, her eyes clear and direct. She didn't look at me with the soft, condescending pity so often reserved for the elderly. She looked at me as an equal, a new client, a peer. "Thank you, Miss Davis," I said, my voice steady. "It's a pleasure to meet you in person." "The pleasure is all mine. We've already taken care of the fare. Let's get your bag, and I'll show you to your new home." She spoke the word home with such simple, uncomplicated sincerity that it almost brought tears to my eyes. A home. Not a guest room, not a space to be tolerated. A home. We walked into a lobby filled with natural light. The air smelled not of disinfectant or institutional food, but of lemon polish, fresh flowers, and the faint, clean scent of salt from the sea. Residents sat in comfortable armchairs, reading newspapers or chatting quietly. A few of them looked up as we passed, offering gentle smiles and soft good mornings. There was no sense of confinement here, only a quiet, dignified community. It was a world away from the suffocating silence of Greg and Melanie's house. Miss Davis led me to an elevator, and as we ascended, she didn't fill the silence with meaningless chatter. She gave me a moment to breathe, to absorb my new surroundings. When the doors opened on the third floor, she led me down a wide, carpeted hallway to a door at the very end, Suite 3B. She unlocked it and pushed it open, stepping aside to let me enter first. "Here we are," she said. The first thing I noticed was the light. It poured into the room, a brilliant, cleansing flood of it. The suite was modest but beautifully appointed, with clean, simple furniture and walls painted a soft, creamy white. There was a comfortable-looking bed, a small kitchenette, an armchair, and a writing desk. It was a blank canvas, my canvas. But all of that was secondary. My eyes were drawn past it all, to the far wall, which was almost entirely made of glass. A sliding door led out to a small, private balcony, and beyond that, there was nothing but the sky and the sea. The view was breathtaking. The endless, rhythmic motion of the waves, the cry of a distant gull, the vast open horizon. I walked past Miss Davis, past the furniture, drawn by an irresistible force. My hand found the handle of the glass door. It slid open with a smooth, satisfying whoosh, and the room was instantly filled with the sound of the ocean and the feel of the air. It was cool, fresh, and carried the sharp, briny tang of salt and seaweed. It was the cleanest, most life-affirming air I had ever breathed. I stepped out onto the balcony, gripping the cool metal railing, and closed my eyes. I took a deep, slow breath, pulling the sea air deep into my lungs, holding it there for a moment before letting it out in a long, slow sigh. But this was not Greg's sigh of weary resignation. This was a sigh of release, a sigh of arrival. When I opened my eyes, I was smiling. It was a real smile, a feeling that started deep inside and spread outwards, warming my face, crinkling the corners of my eyes. I hadn't felt a smile like that in years. "I think you'll like the air here," Miss Davis said quietly from the doorway. Her tone was knowing, full of an empathy that didn't need my story to understand my relief. "Yes," I said, turning to face her, the smile still on my lips. "Yes, I think I will." She returned my smile. Good. Now for the practicalities. She didn't treat me like a fragile artifact to be handled with care. She treated me like a capable adult ready to begin a new chapter. She handed me a welcome packet and a weekly schedule. "This has all the information you'll need. Meal times, laundry services, emergency contacts. And this," she said, tapping the schedule, "is a list of our current activities and classes. The book club is reading a fascinating biography this month. The ceramics workshop on Tuesdays is very popular. Helen, our instructor, is a marvel. There are lectures on art history, a gardening club, and a walking group that goes out every morning, rain or shine." She wasn't giving me a list of things to keep a sad old woman busy. She was presenting me with a menu of possibilities, an inventory of potential new passions. She was giving me not custody, but opportunity. "Take your time to settle in," she continued, her tone brisk but kind. "Your suitcase is here. If you need anything at all, and I do mean anything, my office is on the ground floor, first door on the left, or you can just use the internal phone. We're here to help, Nora, but we're not here to hover." With that, she gave me a final, encouraging nod. "I'll let you get acquainted with your new view." And she left, closing the door softly behind her, leaving me alone in my new kingdom. I stood there for a long time, in the center of the room, the sea breeze swirling around me, the sound of the waves a constant, soothing rhythm. I looked at the single leather suitcase sitting by the door. It looked so small, so insignificant in this bright, open space. I walked over to it and laid it on the bed. I unlatched it. The first thing I took out was the silver-framed photograph of David. I carried it over to the writing desk and placed it there, angling it so he, too, could see the ocean. Then came the books, which I set beside him, the jewelry box, and finally the clothes, which I hung carefully in the empty closet. In less than 10 minutes, the suitcase was empty. My old life was unpacked. But the room didn't feel cluttered. It felt founded. These few precious objects were not the remnants of a life that was over. They were the foundation stones of a new one. Here, they were not a source of a smell to be aired out. They were the anchors of a woman who had crossed an ocean to find a new shore. I walked back out to the balcony, leaning on the railing and looking out at the endless horizon. I was no longer a ghost in someone else's house. I was the founder and sole citizen of my own country. And its national anthem was the sound of the sea. 3 months passed. Not as a series of days to be endured, but as a collection of moments to be savored. The rhythm of my life was no longer dictated by the silent, anxious footsteps of someone trying not to disturb. It was now set by the eternal, powerful cadence of the tides. I learned the subtle shifts in the color of the water, from the pale turquoise of a calm morning to the deep, angry cobalt of an approaching storm. The ocean became my confidant, my teacher, my clock. My new life took shape, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small, quiet rituals. Mornings began on my balcony with a cup of strong black coffee, watching the sun ignite the edge of the world. I joined the walking group, and my legs, once stiff and hesitant, grew strong from trekking along the sandy bluffs. I discovered, to my immense surprise, that my hands, which I had thought were only good for knitting and holding teacups, had a talent for shaping clay. The ceramic studio became my sanctuary, a place where I could take a formless lump of earth and mold it into something solid and beautiful. I made a small, imperfect blue bowl, the color of a robin's egg, and I kept it on my desk to hold the sea glass I collected on my walks. I made a friend. Her name was Helen, the ceramics instructor, a woman with a riot of curly white hair, a laugh that boomed from her belly, and hands perpetually dusted with dried clay. She was a retired history professor who saw the world not as a series of endings, but as a library of stories. She never asked about my past, but she listened with fierce attention whenever I chose to share a small piece of it. One crisp autumn afternoon, she and I were walking on the beach during low tide. The wet sand was firm under our shoes, littered with tangled seaweed and the treasures the ocean had discarded. The air was sharp with the scent of salt and decay, a smell I now found invigorating. I had spent so long trying to erase my own scent from the world, and here the world was unapologetically, powerfully fragrant. "Look at this one," Helen said, bending down to pick up a spiraled whelk shell, its interior polished to a pearlescent sheen. "Perfect. The architecture of the sea is flawless, isn't it?" I smiled, running my own fingers over a smooth, gray stone I'd found. "It knows what to keep and what to let go of." Helen glanced at me, her eyes knowing that it does. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. It washes everything clean. A lesson for us all, I suppose. We walked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the cry of the gulls and the rhythmic shushing of the waves. I felt a sense of companionship, of being seen and accepted, that was so profound it felt like a physical warmth spreading through my chest. I had not chosen loneliness. I had simply escaped a prison that masqueraded as family. Here, in this community of storytellers and artists and walkers, I had found my tribe. That evening, I sat on my balcony. The sun had set, leaving the sky painted in bruised shades of purple and orange. A cool breeze ruffled the pages of the journal I now kept. It was a simple, leather-bound book, a place where I was finally recording my own story, in my own words. For years, my life had been a narrative written by others, the dutiful wife, the grieving widow, the burdensome mother-in-law. Now, I was the author. I wrote about the color of the whelk shell, about the sound of Helen's laugh, about the satisfying weight of wet clay in my hands. I was not just living, I was bearing witness to my own life, finding the poetry in the ordinary, quiet moments. As I was writing, my phone, which was sitting on the small table beside me, began to vibrate. The screen lit up the twilight, and a name appeared. Asterisk. Greg. Asterisk. My breath caught for a fraction of a second, a ghost from another life. I looked at the name, at the insistent, pulsing light. In the first few weeks after I'd left, he had called and texted incessantly, frantic, then angry, then pleading. I had read the first few messages, a torrent of "Where are you?" and "How could you do this?" And Melanie is beside herself. There was no apology. There was no understanding. There was only the outrage of people whose convenience had been disrupted. I had never replied. Eventually, the calls had slowed to a trickle, and now weeks would pass without a word. This call, I knew, was different. It was the eve of my 77th birthday. This was likely a call of obligation, a final, half-hearted attempt to bridge a chasm they themselves had dug. The old Nora would have been a storm of conflicting emotions. Her heart would have hammered with a painful mix of hope and dread. Her hand would have trembled as she reached for the phone, desperate for a crumb of love, willing to accept any hollow apology just to feel connected to her son again. But I was not the old Nora. I looked at the glowing screen, and I felt nothing. No anger, no bitterness, just a vast, calm, and quiet distance. It was like watching a ship from a far-off shore, a vessel whose journey no longer had anything to do with mine. His life, his panic, his belated guilt, it was his weather system, and I was no longer living in his climate. My thumb moved to the screen. With a simple, steady motion, I pressed the red decline button. The screen went dark. The vibration stopped. Silence returned, deeper and more peaceful than before. The only sound was the eternal murmur of the ocean. The call was not a temptation. It was a test, a final exam for the new life I had built, and I had passed. I picked up my pen and turned back to my journal. The words came to me then, clear and certain, the final piece of my story falling into place. I wrote the last entry for the night, the culmination of a 3-month journey from a suffocating room to this infinite balcony. Asterisk. They wanted to air out the room because they said the smell of old age was killing them. For 3 months now, I have been breathing the air of the ocean. I have come to understand that the smell of old age they feared was never about lavender or medicine. It was the smell of their own fear, the fear of decay, of dependency, of death. They tried to air out their own mortality. What they didn't know, what I didn't know, is that the smell of freedom has a scent all its own. It smells of salt and wind and wet clay and the endless clean promise of the tide. Asterisk. I closed the book and looked out at the dark water, where the first stars were beginning to appear, reflected on the restless surface. I was home. I was not just breathing. I was finally, truly alive.